lean software development that builds on Toyota production system concepts, very similar to much of the rest of the Danaher business system. So these are some of the concepts. I'm sorry this slide's a little bit busy, but you can see there's quite a long list of things which are comparative. So the whole concept of single piece flow, where you take one piece of work and you take it right through the system. You don't try to batch things up too much. The continuous improvement aspects we have at the end of a sprint, which is usually 2 or 3 weeks of work, we have a retrospective meeting. So we look at what's gone well, what's not gone quite so well, and we think about what we want to take forward in terms of actions to change our process and improve our process. Visual management, very strong aspect of Scrum on which lean software development is built. So we have things like burn down charts, which tell us what our progress to date is, and also enable us to calculate when we can expect to deliver our current feature set or backlog. We actually exploit the concept of Hajunka, whereby we don't want to engineer things any sooner than they need to be done. So we don't want to build up lots of backlog of work in progress, which is essentially waste. So we try to have very short release cycles as well as short implementation cycles. Implementation cycles, the sprints might just be 2 weeks, but the release cycles may also be relatively frequent. Now, obviously, it depends on your product. In your case, that may not be relevant to have very frequent releases, but in a lot of environments, software survives by giving people the opportunity to upgrade their systems at various points in time. So Kanban, this is really limiting the amount of work that's in the process at any one time. Again, very strong aspect of lean software development. In Scrum, we want people to focus on a small number of stories and to get them completed before they move on to something else. So if we can get every individual in a Scrum team all focused on 1 or 2 stories at a time, working together as a team to finish those off, that can be extremely powerful, and it avoids all the waste involved in moving from one task to another and back again, as we often do in software environments. We have a strong idea of quality whereby we do not want any defects to be passed on. And this is absolutely fundamental to the Toyota production system and indeed to many production systems these days. Everybody is responsible for quality. There's no quality department as such. That doesn't mean that you don't necessarily have a QA department, which is quality assurance. That's something else. That's testing that we've got the quality. That's not finding the defects to deal with. So daily management, in Scrum, we have a very strong sense of that as well. We have daily meetings, usually planned to be no more than 15 minutes, involving all the members of the team, where they can share what they've done since the last meeting, what they plan to do before the next meeting, and to expose anything that's holding them up in terms of what we call an impediment in Scrum. Finally, the process is very simple, repeatable, and easily taught. So what we do in lean software development is fundamentally based on Scrum, but then with a few additional things that bring it into line with the rest of the Danaher business system. It's important to understand that there's a fundamental difference between creating software and manufacturing things on a production line. And this extract from a book by Poppendick, which itself is entitled Lean Software Development, by the way, highlights some of those differences. So in production, quality is conformance to requirements. That's not the same in development. Quality is fitness for use when we're developing new product designs. Similarly, any variation in a production system is bad. We're always trying to minimize the variation so that we can keep the process under control. Actually, when we're developing new product concepts, new ways of doing things, trying to get the very best solution for our customer, variable results are sometimes very good. They help us understand what the options are, and then we can select from those. Similarly, iteration generates waste or rework in a production environment, actually iteration can generate value when we're talking about product design. So these are the differences between the two systems, and it's very important to understand those. There's probably a few other differences as well, which I haven't listed here. So for those of you who are not familiar with Scrum, this diagram depicts the basic elements of the Scrum process. The idea is that you have a product backlog, which essentially contains a list of all the features that you want to implement in the project that you're undertaking. So that would be up until typically the next release of the software. Now, from that product backlog, you take a number of items, and we usually call them stories, which describe how the development work would give benefit to the customer. So it's not quite the same as features. So stories are slightly differently framed from features. And then there can be issues about translating feature requirements into good stories, and that's a skill that you'll have to learn probably at some point if you undertake the process. So we go from the product backlog, which is for the whole, let's say, 6-month cycle of a project. We will take off a number of stories and we'll produce a list of the work that we need to do in the next 2 weeks to complete just 1 or 2 stories. And that sprint backlog, as it's called, may consist of several tasks for each story. So there's another level of granularity is produced at that point. And that will be done in a sprint planning meeting lasting maybe a couple of hours, maybe 3 or 4 hours. So over the course of the sprint, the team will implement that work in its entirety. That means to say they will do anything they need to do in terms of design of code, also the coding itself, maybe unit tests that go with the code and prove it, full integration of that code into the current code base. On a daily basis, we would expect people to be integrating code actually, and then full testing of the features underlying that story so that we understand that everything at that point is complete, and we have what we call this definition of done. Once things are done, that means that we don't expect to have to go back and make any further changes to the code that supports those particular story or stories. So that's quite demanding because we want to implement stories in their entirety, right through the whole design cycle in, it says 30 days here, but very often teams are working and doing that in 14 days in a 2-week period. So there is good communication across the team, and that is confined to a large extent to the daily Scrum, which is, as I say, a 15-minute meeting. That doesn't preclude the use of any other types of meetings that you may need, but it certainly, you wouldn't want to have a meeting of everybody in the team more frequently than that in general. So the idea is that we produce a working increment of software. And we talk about this working increment being potentially shippable. Obviously, in the early stages of a project, you don't have software with which you can do very much, and you certainly wouldn't want to ship it out to a customer. But the features that do work, you expect them to be fully working and fully tested. So just thinking in very primitive terms, if it's just the a splash screen that comes up on a Windows application, and that's all you see of the application, then it shuts down again, that could be, a big triumph for the first sprint in your project, if you can actually see that much working. So we try to have this sense of everything being very visible, always having everything working. The definition of done necessarily includes that there are no defects arising from that piece of work. And so it's quite a disciplined approach, and quite hard for people to move across to this. The great thing about it, though, is that you can now involve much larger groups of people than perhaps the work that you're used to doing with, one person per product type development. So bringing in multiple people in a team, typically somewhere between about 6 and 9 people in a team, getting them to work together, being highly focused on achieving what they've agreed to do in the next sprint. That's the name of the game. So this is trying to illustrate the difference in the two approaches of waterfall and Scrum. So in waterfall, we we like to prepare the documents at each stage, sign them off, pass them on to the next stage. I've possibly introduced extra stages into this list for emphasis, but it's quite possible that your process includes all these steps. So there may be some requirement specification that's converted into a software specification or a system specification, so some other further document. Then we think about, well, how is this going to be implemented in code? What's the structure of that going to be, the architecture? And in fact, there may be another step, which is the design of the code. In other words, how particular modules it will interact with each other, what the interfaces will be, and so forth. Then we get to the coding, and we may have a subsequent step to put on top of that unit testing. Sometimes people do that the other way around. They write the unit tests first, and then they write the code, and that's typical of a test-driven environment. But you will, of course, also want to integrate that code, test it in its integrated form, and then there may be more formal verification and validation steps, finally documentation, and then the release. So the idea in Waterfall is that you complete each of these steps in its entirety as you go through the process. I have never in my whole career, 40 years, ever come across anybody who's ever succeeded in doing that. There's always a little bit of iteration going on. There's always a bit of rework and backtracking. So, to my mind, Waterfall is a wonderful ideal, but it's never been achieved. You might say the same of Scrum, but we come at it from a totally different angle. So we have a planning meeting at the beginning of the process, and then we go through a series of sprints, as I described before, where we take on a number of stories in each sprint. There may be some sort of finishing or finalizing process where we're not adding features, but we are removing any defects that we can find at that stage and preparing maybe documentation. So there's a little bit of a waterfall aspect when we're doing that. And then we finally get to the release. So just at this point, can I ask, are there any questions, having got that far in the presentation?
Hi, Trevor. This is Steph. I just have one comment. Volker Carl is in the room with us. He's visiting for 2 weeks.
Yeah. Hi there, Volker.
Hi. Hi, Trevor.
So I thought you'd let you know that you have an ally on the side, too. And also, I have a question about, you said 6 to 9 people teams. Do you do this with larger teams also?
Yes, we do. And the way we handle that is we would usually have, we would break the requirements down perhaps into 2 or more lists. So each team built under that would have their own backlog that they would be working at. And then we have a process we call Scrum of Scrums, where the representatives from each of the the sub-teams can meet together and compare issues, make sure that they're scheduling things in a sensible order, because there may be dependencies between the 2 teams and so forth. So yeah, that process is entirely handleable. I'll mention later that, for example, Microsoft has now moved to Scrum with a further 17,000 developers as a matter of policy, having experimented with it over a number of years. So they're now even putting the teams that are doing the operating system development into a Scrum process. So that, if that gives us some sort of endorsement of this process, I hope people understand what's happening there.
Thanks.
Another question, Trevor. This is Paul Hadron.
Oh, hi there, Paul.
How you doing?
Fine.
So one stage that I don't see on there that's within every project is schedule development. How's that handled?
Okay, so if I go back to the previous diagram here, what we do in Scrum actually is we don't try to do too much detailed planning of all of these features that we have in our backlog. But what we do try